I need you to picture something. A man in a uniform that used to mean power, absolute, unquestionable power, sitting in a cold room somewhere in Bavaria, April 1945. The walls are thin. Outside, you can hear artillery, not distant artillery. Close the kind that rattles the windows and makes the candles flicker. He has a folder on the table in front of him. He looks at it for a long time. Then he opens the stove, slides the folder in, and watches it burn. He never speaks of what was in that folder. Not to the Americans who capture him 3 days later, not to his wife when he returns home years after, not to his children, not to a priest. He carries it like a stone sewn into his chest, and when he dies in 1974 in a quiet suburb of Munich, that stone goes into the ground with him. This story is about what was in that folder, and the dozens of men just like him who made the same choice to burn, to bury, to silence. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear didn't make it into the history books, and there's a reason for that. You know, most people think they understand World War II. They've seen the documentaries. They know the dates: September 1939, June 1944, May 1945. They know the names: Hitler, Rommel, Eisenhower, Patton. Think the story has been told completely, that every corner of that war has been lit up and examined. But here's what I want you to understand before we go any further, and I mean this directly to you. The person watching this right now, the most dangerous secrets in history are never the ones that got exposed. They're the ones that died quietly, in burned folders, in deathbed silences, in looks exchanged between men who swore never to speak. The German officer corps in 1945 was not just an army collapsing. It was a machine desperately trying to erase itself. And some of what it erased, we are only now beginning to piece together. To understand the secret, you have to understand the men. The German Wehrmacht officer, particularly those who reached the rank of colonel, general, or higher, was not a simple soldier. These were educated men. Many came from aristocratic Prussian families with military traditions stretching back 200 years. They understood logistics, psychology, geopolitics. They were not blindly loyal fanatics, though some were. Many of them were something far more complicated and, in some ways, far more troubling. They were pragmatists who made calculated decisions about when to follow, when to resist, and when to simply look away. And in 1945, as the Reich collapsed from both east and west simultaneously, those calculated minds were working overtime. Not to win the war, they knew that was finished. They were working on something else entirely. They were working on survival, their own, their families, and in some cases, the survival of information they believed could never be allowed to surface. The Eastern Front had been the crucible. If you want to find where the deepest secrets were forged, you go east. You go to the vast, frozen, incomprehensible scale of the Soviet Union, where the Wehrmacht committed acts that existed in a category beyond conventional warfare. Not all officers participated equally, but all of them knew. That was the thing. Every man of rank knew. There was a moment, and this has been reconstructed from fragmented post-war interviews, from letters discovered decades later in private collections, from the testimony of junior officers who survived and eventually, haltingly, began to talk. There was a moment somewhere in late 1943, maybe early 1944, when the senior German officer corps collectively understood something that they could never say out loud. Not in a meeting, not in a memo, not in any document that could be found. They understood that if Germany lost this war, and they were now certain that Germany would lose this war, the accounting would be unlike anything in the history of military defeat. The scale of what had happened, what they had ordered, permitted, witnessed, and in many cases carefully documented in their own meticulous German way, would not be forgiven, would not be negotiated, would not be quietly absorbed into the ambiguity of war. It would be prosecuted. And so, the burning began. Long before April 1945, long before the Americans crossed the Rhine or the Soviets encircled Berlin, the burning began in the minds of men who understood exactly what fire could and could not erase. Let me tell you about a specific man, because history lives in specific men, not in abstractions. His name was General Friedrich Kittan. Not one of the famous names, not Guderian or Mongstein or Model-Katayan, was the kind of officer who made the machine work competent, disciplined, deeply embedded in the operational structures of the Eastern Front from 1941 through 1944. He commanded at the divisional level during the advance into the Soviet Union, and later during the long, grinding, catastrophic retreat. What men like Kuhn knew was not just the broad strokes of military failure. It was the granular, documented, systematically recorded reality of what the Wehrmacht had done in the territories it occupied, the coordination with the SS, the deliberate starvation of Soviet prisoners of war, 3 million of whom died in German captivity by the end of 1941 alone. A fact that was not hidden from officers of his rank, but rather tracked, reported, and in some cases justified in official communications with clinical detachment. Kahachon kept records. This was the German way. Everything was recorded. Orders, counter-orders, reports, requisitions, population statistics, casualty figures. The Wehrmacht bureaucracy was staggering in its thoroughness. And for years, Kayachin had been part of that bureaucracy. His signature on documents, his name and correspondence chains that, if ever assembled and examined in a courtroom, would tell a story that no defense attorney could effectively counter. In the winter of 1944, as the front collapsed eastward with terrible momentum, Kachan began a quiet, systematic process. He went through his records, not just his personal files. He was thorough enough to contact subordinates and former staff officers, asking careful questions about what they had retained. He built a picture of the paper trail that connected him to events he could not afford to have connected to his name. And then, piece by piece, he made it disappear. This was not unique to Kachon. This was happening across the officer corps with a coordination that was never formally organized, because a formal organization would itself have been evidence. It was instead the spontaneous, parallel behavior of men who shared a common understanding of their situation. A collective act of erasure performed by individuals acting alone, producing the same result as if they had planned it together in a room. Now, here's where it gets complicated, and I want you to sit with this complexity because it matters. Not everything that was hidden out of guilt. Some of it was hidden out of something that, in the twisted moral landscape of that moment, might almost be called principle. There were German officers, and this is documented, this is real, who had actively worked against Hitler, who had participated in resistance networks, who had passed information, who had been peripheral or even central to the July 20th, 1944 assassination attempt. Men who had, at enormous personal risk, tried to end the war early and save lives on both sides. These men also burned documents in 1945. They burned the names of colleagues who had helped them. They burned evidence of contacts with Allied intelligence. They burned the records of their own quiet acts of resistance, not because those acts were shameful, but because revealing them would mean revealing the network. And the network included people who were still alive, people with families, people who had not yet been caught. The silence of a guilty man and the silence of a man protecting others can look identical from the outside. That was one of the most disorienting realizations for Allied interrogators after the war. They could not always tell which silence they were facing, and the German officers knew this. Some of them used it deliberately. A man who had both things to hide his own participation in atrocities and his peripheral connection to the resistance could use the latter as a shield for the former. He could hint at his resistance credentials, allow the Allied interrogators to believe that his silence was protective rather than and walk away from the table having said nothing of substance about either. The moral calculus of survival in 1945 was not clean. It was never clean. Think about the pressure these men were under, and I mean really think about it, not as an abstraction, but as a physical, lived reality. Imagine knowing that the army bearing down on you from the east, the Soviet army, which had been through which had watched its own people starved and murdered in their millions, which was operating under commanders who had no illusions about what the Wehrmacht had done on Soviet soil. Imagine knowing that army was days away. And imagine knowing that the army coming from the West, the Americans and British, was more likely to treat you according to the Geneva Convention, more likely to process you through a legal framework, more likely to give you a lawyer and a trial. This knowledge produced one of the most significant and underexamined migrations of World War II's final weeks, the deliberate, calculated movement of German forces and German officers toward the west, not a military retreat. Driven by tactical necessity, but a calculated human movement driven by a very clear understanding of what capture by which army would mean. Entire Wehrmacht units that had been fighting the Soviets simply turned around and marched west, sometimes covering hundreds of kilometers on foot, to surrender to the Americans instead. Their commanders understood the geography of justice in 1945 with cold precision. And as they moved, they coordinated with each other about what to say, what to deny, what to admit to, in formal conversations in burnt-out farmhouses, in forest clearings, in the ruins of German towns. Officers who had served together for years, who trusted each other in the specific way that men trust each other after surviving shared extremity. Talking quietly about how to manage what came next. These conversations, these agreements about silence, were the most consequential secrets of all, because the documents could be burned, the physical evidence could be destroyed, but the memories lived in men, and the only way to manage the memories was through the living men themselves. Some chose silence until death. Some broke, decades later, and what they said in those late confessions is extraordinary and disturbing, and still being processed by historians. And some took their secrets all the way down, as the man in Bavaria took his burned folder into ground that never gave anything back. I want to talk to you for a moment about what this means. Not just historically, but in terms of what we understand about men under impossible pressure. If you've ever faced a moment where telling the truth would cost you everything, your reputation, your family, your freedom, then you have the smallest possible glimpse of what these men faced. Multiply that by a factor that has no name. The truth they were holding wasn't embarrassing. It wasn't professionally damaging. It was, in many cases, the kind of truth that ends with a rope. And yet some of them talked. Some of them, not many, but some found in the final years of their lives that the weight of the secret had become heavier than the weight of the consequences. Old men in their 70s and 80s who had built new lives in post-war Germany or in South America or in quiet corners of the American Midwest, who had families who knew nothing, who had sat across from their own children at dinner tables for 40 years with a wall of silence behind their eyes. Some of them broke. The confessions that emerged from these breakings are some of the most haunting documents in the historical record of the 20th century, not because they revealed operational military secrets, not because they changed the known outcome of the war, but because of what they revealed about the interior life of men carrying that kind of weight for that length of time. One former officer, interviewed by a German historian in the 1980s, won't use his name because his family is still living. Described the experience of sitting through the Nuremberg trials as a free man, watching other officers being prosecuted for things he had also done, and feeling not relief, but a kind of slow suffocation. Every day that passed without exposure was another day the secret grew heavier, he said. And this is translated from German. So the cadence is mine, he said. I thought I was surviving. I did not understand for many years that I had simply chosen a slower way to die. That sentence stopped me cold when I first read it, and I think it should stop you, too. By early 1945, the machinery of German military intelligence, the military counterintelligence, signals intelligence, was itself in the process of being dismantled, defected, and in many cases, actively handed to the Americans and British. This was another layer of the secret. Senior intelligence officers who had spent years running networks, managing sources, handling encrypted communications, these men had something the Allies desperately wanted, not German secrets. German secrets were increasingly irrelevant by April 1945. What they had was infrastructure. Networks, operational knowledge of how to run intelligence in Eastern Europe against the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not a concept in April 1945. Not yet. Not formally, but the men in the American intelligence apparatus who were processing captured German officers were already thinking about it. And some of the German officers they were processing were thinking about it too, with the same cold clarity that had defined their entire careers. The bargains struck in that transition period, spring and summer of 1945, between American intelligence and German officers who had knowledge worth having, are among the most morally complex transactions in modern history. A man who had committed serious crimes against humanity in the East could, if he had the right kind of knowledge to offer, find himself not in a prisoner dock, but in a quiet house in Frankfurt or Munich, being debriefed by American officers who needed what he knew and were willing to ask no hard questions in exchange. This was not a secret for long, in the broad sense. It became known, controversial, investigated, but the specific details, which men, which bargains, what exactly was traded, what exactly was forgiven, those details are still not fully in the light, because the American side of those conversations was also, for decades, classified, and by the time much of it was declassified, many of the men involved were dead and unavailable to question. The secrets compounded, German officers protecting themselves, American intelligence protecting its sources and methods, post-war German governments with their own reasons to manage the narrative of Wehrmacht complicity, Soviet authorities who had captured their own set of German officers and extracted their own information and had their own reasons to control what was known and when. You were never going to get the clean, complete story. Nobody was ever going to sit down and tell you everything. The architecture of silence was too well built, too many-sided, too deeply reinforced by the self-interest of too many powerful institutions. What you get instead, what historians and researchers and journalists have assembled over 8 decades, is fragments, pieces. A document found in an estate sale, a letter discovered in a private archive, a recorded interview made by a grandson who sensed that his grandfather was holding something and persuaded him to talk, once, briefly, into a microphone. Fragment by fragment, the shape of the secret becomes clearer. It never becomes complete. It may never become complete. There is a particular kind of German officer whose storied threads through all of this in a way that I find almost unbearable to contemplate. The officer who knew the crimes were wrong, who had no ideological investment in Nazism, who had joined the Wehrmacht because it was the German army, and he was a German soldier, and that was what German soldiers did, who had followed orders not because he believed in them, but because the alternative refusal. Resistance, defection, carried consequences he calculated he could not accept, who had told himself, in a specific way, that intelligent men, in impossible situations, tell themselves things, that his individual choices within a monstrous system made no difference to the outcome of that system. These men existed. They are not a convenient fiction invented to complicate a story that would be simpler if all the perpetrators were true believers. They were real, complicated, morally compromised human beings who made choices that contributed to outcomes they claimed to oppose. And in 1945, these men faced a particular kind of reckoning that was different from the reckoning faced by the true believers. The true believer could, at least, stand behind his belief. He could say, "I thought this was right. I was wrong, but I believed." It's not even particularly sympathetic, but it is a coherent position. It has an interior logic. The officer who knew it was wrong has no such coherence available. His position reduces to, "I knew, and I continued, because stopping would have cost me something I valued more than stopping." When you hold that up in the light, it doesn't look like much. And these men knew it didn't look like much. That knowledge was part of what they carried. The silence of these particular men was the most absolute, because to speak was not just to expose their actions. It was to expose the reasoning behind their actions. And the reasoning was something they could not defend even to themselves. Before I tell you how this ends, and it ends in a way that will stay with you, I want to ask you something. This channel exists because you care about history, not the cleaned-up textbook version. The real version, the version with weight in it, with moral complexity, with human beings making terrible decisions under conditions you and I will never face. If that's why you're here, then you already know what this kind of storytelling costs: the hours of research, the careful reconstruction, the commitment to getting it right rather than getting it simple. If this story has meant something to you, if you felt even once in the last several minutes that you were actually inside history rather than reading about it from a distance, then hit that like button right now. Leave a comment below. Tell me what you think these men should have done. Tell me if you think silence can ever be the right choice. And if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. Because this is the kind of story we tell here every week. And you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let me tell you how it ends. The end comes in pieces, across decades, in places far removed from the ruins of the Third Reich. In 1958, a historian named Martin Bruch, working at the newly established Institute for Contemporary History in Munich, begins systematically interviewing former Wehrmacht officers. What he encounters, again and again, is a wall. Polite, articulate, intelligent men who speak freely about tactics and operations and the military history of the war, who become quietly impenetrable the moment the conversation turns to certain subjects. He notes in his personal diary, published posthumously, that the silence has a texture. It is not the silence of men who have nothing to say. It is the silence of men who have chosen, with great deliberateness, not to say Italiano. In 1963, the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials begin, and for the first time a significant portion of the German public is confronted in detail with the machinery of what had happened. The trials produce 22 convictions. They also produce, in the former officer corps, a new wave of document destruction and coordinated silence, as men who had not been called as witnesses watched what happened to those who had, and quietly made certain that nothing connecting them to the events under examination would ever surface. In 1977, an elderly man in a small town in Lower Saxony, a former lieutenant colonel who had spent the decades after the war as a hardware store owner, a church deacon, a grandfather of 7, suffers a stroke. During his recovery, he experiences what his daughter describes as a kind of loosening. He begins to talk. Not clearly, not in complete sentences, not in any way that could be recorded or documented, but fragments. Names, places. His daughter, who is in her 40s and has spent her life knowing her father carried something heavy, sits with him through these fragments and tries to understand them. She doesn't fully succeed. When he dies, 3 months later, she is left with fragments she can't assemble into a complete picture, and a feeling she describes to a researcher 40 years later as like finding pieces of a letter that someone had torn into very small pieces, and knowing the letter said something important, but never being able to read it. In 1995, the Wehrmacht exhibition opens in Hamburg, a landmark and deeply controversial public display of documentary evidence connecting the regular German army, not just the SS, to atrocities in the East. The response in Germany is convulsive. Denial, anger, grief, and slowly, haltingly, something that begins to resemble reckoning. Veterans, still living men in their 80s, men who in some cases are the very men who burned folders in April 1945, are confronted publicly with evidence that their silence had helped suppress. Some respond with continued denial, some respond with anger. A few respond with something that looks, from the outside, like relief, as if the secret, now partially out, has lifted something they had been carrying for 50 years. And in the archives, in collections across Germany, the United States, Russia, Poland, the United Kingdom, researchers continue to find things a little error. An operational report there, a personnel file with annotations that suggest connections no one had previously documented. The picture builds slowly, incompletely, in the way that all suppressed history eventually builds, when enough time passes and enough people dig. What the picture shows is this. The secrets that German officers took to their graves in 1945 were not a single secret. They were a structure, a layered, reinforced, mutually supporting architecture of silence, built by hundreds of individual men, making individual choices, producing a collective effect that no single act of burning or burying could have achieved alone. The secret survived, not because any one man was strong enough to keep it forever, but because enough men kept enough of it long enough that the men who knew the most were dead before the questions got specific enough to reach them. Some of what they hid we now know, reconstructed from peripheral evidence, from the fragments that survived, from the testimonies of men lower in the chain who had less to lose and sometimes chose to speak. Some of what they hid, we will likely never know in full. The specific, granular, documentable detail that would transform a historical understanding into a historical record. The man in Bavaria burned his folder. The fire took the paper. But fire cannot take context. It cannot take the memory of the men who delivered those documents to him, or the men who received copies, or the men who referenced them in other documents that were not burned. History is relentless in that way. You can destroy evidence. You can silence witnesses. You can construct elaborate architectures of forgetting. But the architecture always has cracks, and light, given enough time, finds them. The secrets that German officers took to their graves in 1945 are not entirely in those graves. Parts of them are still in the archives, waiting. Parts of them are in the testimony of men who are gone now, but who spoke before they went. Parts of them are in the silence itself, in the places where the record goes quiet, where the documentation stops, where the paper trail ends in ash. History is made of what men chose to say and what they chose not to say. The choosing is itself a record, if you know how to read it. These men chose silence. And their silence tells us something that their words never could. It tells us exactly how much there was to hide.